Chapter 1: Not Knowing Your Enemy. If our goal is to learn lessons from the Vietnam War that we can apply to today's war, then even I find it tempting to start with the United States. For those of us in the West, we are responsible for our side, especially in acts of aggression. So, if you're impatient, start with the next chapter. For the rest of you, let's start with the quote-unquote enemy, to emphasize the first failing of imperialist hubris, where having superior power leads to underestimating the opposition. Arrogance meets ignorance. In this chapter, we'll introduce critical tools, class analysis, colonialism's divide and rule playbook, and historical materialism, and apply these to the Vietnamese Communists' evolution from French colonialism to the Japanese occupation during World War II, to the First Indochina War, and finally, the Second Indochina War, the so-called Vietnam War. Have you heard of a phrase structured like this? Iran knows more about the US than the US knows about Iran. We can replace Iran with any country. This phrase is comical when applied to the public. It's self-destructive when applied to decision makers. Looking at this phrase from a different angle, everyone else knowing more about the US speaks to how profound US soft power is. Truly, the US's greatest asset. US mass consumerist culture has spread far and wide in the world's imagination. We just heard Trump's speech in China mention the US influence of basketball and blue jeans. On the surface, there's entertainment, Hollywood, music, professional sports leagues. Deeper down, there's the imagery of modernization, so shopping malls, parking lots, highways, and suburbs. Even deeper are values, like individual freedom from social responsibilities. Furthermore, the privileged classes in colonial and post-colonial countries have mostly gone through Western education, and their wealth has become coupled with Western institutions, especially Wall Street and the US dollar. Of course, we need to unpack the contradictions and contestations in all of this. For example, Christopher E. Gostcha's book, Vietnam: A New History, adds this wrinkle. Quote, "Many authors like to connect Vietnamese republicanism at this time to the American model, citing Ho Chi Minh's reliance on the American Declaration of Independence of 1776 to craft his own in 1945. This American-centered view completely overlooks half a century of Vietnamese republicanism." End quote. So, how should we analyze Vietnam? Let's introduce the lens of class analysis. First, we identify the classes based on the main activity for survival. For example, peasants grow crops, landlords extract rent. Second, what are the class interests? For example, peasants benefit from retaining more of their harvest and paying less rent. How do these interests relate to other classes? For example, landlords benefit from receiving more rent. Thus, there's a class conflict between landlords and peasants. Third, how aware is each class of their class interests? What's their level of class consciousness? This is where abstraction of class relations and conflicts and distractions, especially divide and rule identity politics hiding class, are crucial for maintaining class hierarchy. Fourth, how much bargaining power does each class have to achieve their class interests? With lower classes, where each individual lacks power, there's a big difference between being isolated individuals versus being organized. Okay, so that's the general theory. Let's now bring it to life by applying class analysis to Vietnam, pre-French colonialism. I created this class pyramid representing hierarchy of power and relative size. It's frustrating having to piece this together haphazardly from Kalko's 688-page tome. This topic really deserves much clearer definitions and structure, especially from an anthropology lens, which I'll reference in this episode's resources. So first we have the peasantry. Vietnam was a rural society, so the peasantry was the vast majority. Geographically, there was a lack of physical infrastructure, making direct communication and administration more difficult for centralized power. Thus, Kalko mentions how political power and organization was decentralized, scattered amongst village-level hierarchies. Goscha mentions important forms of relations on the village level. Patron-client, so a wealthier patron providing support and protection for the loyalty and services of their clients. Student-teacher, so Confucian mandarins, basically bureaucratic scholars. And kinship, so family ties. Kalko mentions further stratification between rich versus poor and landless peasants. Once again, much more on rural society and the peasantry can be added from an anthropology lens. Second, we have the landlords, the other half of the traditional peasant-landlord structure. Kalko mentions further stratification here between big, middle, and small landlords, but skips over detailed definitions. Third, we have the working class, so wage laborers. These were underdeveloped given the traditional rural society, lacking urbanization. French colonialism would emphasize the extracting of raw materials, where 1/3 of workers were in rubber plantations. Fourth, the petite bourgeoisie. Kalko lists small traders, craftsmen, and crucially, the intelligentsia. I assume this latter includes the displaced and exiled scholar gentry and students who became the origins of the Vietnamese Communist Party. Goscha highlights the pre-communist anti-colonial organizing relying on the patron-client, student-teacher, and kinship ties in rural Vietnam villages. Fifth, we have the national bourgeoisie, supposedly interested in national economic development. This was underdeveloped once again in Vietnam, even compared to India and China, in part because this was blocked by Chinese-dominated commerce in Vietnam. Sixth, we have traditional dynastic elite and their bureaucracy. The traditional elites aimed for more centralized Confucian rule, but their collaboration with French colonialism eroded their own social legitimacy, their soft power. Those that refused collaboration, the exiled scholar gentry, which I grouped with the petite bourgeoisie's intelligentsia, eventually organized anti-colonial movements. Colonialism adds further hierarchy to our class pyramid. Keep in mind, the bottom of the pyramid, predominantly the peasantry, is responsible for the direct labor to produce the material needs and riches for the entire pyramid. Let's add a lens for colonialism. Colonialism relies on divide and rule, since colonial elites are outnumbered and far from home. Crucially, colonialism's playbook targets the contradictions of pre-colonial societies. So first, bribe pre-colonial rulers. Pre-existing hierarchies are already willing and able to rule. It shouldn't be a surprise that Vietnamese dynastic rulers had a history of, at times, leveraging a larger foreign power, especially China, as a powerful patron to fend off domestic rivals, basically acting as a foreign arbitrator, creating a patron-client relationship on this top level of the class pyramid. From Goscha's Vietnam A New History, quote, "Resistance broke out often when the Chinese court pursued assimilationist policies or tried to impose direct rule instead of remembering the advantages of accommodation, flexibility, and indirect rule. The Tron sisters have gone down in history for their heroic rebellion between 39 to 43 CE." End quote. Second, impose rigid identity categorizations, weaponize identity politics to exacerbate and manufacture differences, especially ethnicity and gender, thus hiding shared interests, especially class. Western colonialism has been particularly systematic with this. Third, bribe pre-colonial minorities who lacked integration. Smaller social groups, which colonial categorization exaggerates or even manufactures, can be manipulated into greater dependency for colonial privileges and protection. This can even occur when the group is relatively well off as individuals. Privileged roles in colonial administration include, first, collecting taxes. This is called tax farming and revenue farming. Farming here is not about agriculture, it's about harvesting money. Second, there's money lending. This also relates to usury, which is lending at high interest. Third, colonial military and policing. For a detailed case study of this, see my notes for the book Bound by War: How the United States and the Philippines Built America's First Pacific Century. Now, these minorities become the visible face of colonial exploitation. There are plenty of examples in feudalism and capitalism as well. Thus, these groups can conveniently be used as scapegoats during crises. This relates with the stereotype of Jewish moneylenders under medieval European kings. For an accessible article, see The Truth About Medieval Jewish Moneylending in England by Howard Morris. The Southeast Asian version is Chinese merchants and tax collectors. Both examples weaponize ethnicity, identity politics, to hide class. For example, the ethnic stereotype of the Chinese ethnicity in Southeast Asia omits the masses of poor indentured Chinese migrant labor, the so-called coolies. Fourth, bribe right-wing extremists. This is a combination of the above. Similar to the first tactic, both are politically right-wing, in the sense that they support dominance hierarchies. While they are not pre-existing rulers, right-wing extremists are wannabe rulers. Similar to the second tactic, right-wing extremists also weaponize identity politics to hide class. Similar to the third tactic, right-wing extremists are fringe groups lacking integration. And finally, right-wing extremists are a reflection of colonialism, which itself is right-wing extremism dressed up as gentleman's business and civilizing mission. In summary, colonialism's divide and rule playbook exploits and extends the domestic society's contradictions, in particular class hierarchy. This requires soft power in certain scenarios to attract varying degrees of collaboration. Colonialism relies on local populations to extract their labor and materials, and to administer this extraction. As a side note, it would be interesting to compare this with settler colonialism, which can afford to deploy more hard power to displace and exterminate local populations. We can now take Vietnam's class pyramid, burden it with colonialism, and heat it up with war, and see how much stress this puts on the peasant base and beyond. This left a growing political vacuum for social legitimacy for soft power, which Vietnamese Communists eventually filled. On the burden of colonialism, French colonialism in Vietnam was particularly brutal. As Coco writes, quote, French investment procedures and practices in Vietnam were unquestionably among the most violent and exploitative known to the 20th century. Half of its public funds went into railroads, and of the 80,000 laborers hired to build the link from Hanoi to the Chinese border, which opened in 1910, approximately 30% died on the job. End quote. Goscher writes in Vietnam: A New History, quote, Many of the French traders, bankers, and financiers pushing Napoleon III to intervene in Vietnam were already deeply involved in China and other parts of East Asia, indeed the world. These businessmen probably held Napoleon III's attention for longer than any French missionary telling horror stories about cruel Vietnamese rulers. Opium largely financed the creation of French Cochinchina. End quote. Note, the Second Opium War, waged by Britain and France against China, was from 1856 to 1860. French Cochinchina here refers to the French colonization of South Vietnam from 1862 to 1949. A useful big picture framing of European colonialism is the merger of militarized commerce with for-profit state. See the books Debt, The First 5,000 Years, and Perilous Passage, Mankind and the Global Ascendancy of Capital. Coco writes, quote, "Given the class and political basis of its malaise, the protracted colonial crisis of the dispossessed set the stage for the emergence of the Communist Party. For it was amid the thousands of hamlets of poor peasants, in mines and rubber plantations among undernourished workers, and among anguished students and intellectuals passionately debating Vietnam's future that the longest epoch of human struggle in the 20th century began." End quote. On the flames of war, there's nothing quite like war, hard power, to accelerate social contradictions. Because the status quo's illusion of permanence, crucial in social legitimacy and soft power, is shaken up. During World War II, fascist Imperial Japan invaded most of Southeast Asia, including Vietnam. This first weakened French colonialism. France had surrendered to the Nazis, so Vichy France's colonialism collaborated with Japanese fascists. And second, it further worsened conditions in Vietnam, the famine of 1944 to 45. Thus, Vietnamese Communists, fighting for their survival under French colonialism from 1925 to 1945, now led organized resistance and expanded their social legitimacy, their soft power. Communists focused on, first, patriotic national sovereignty against foreign occupation, and second, famine relief. This created a unifying message for the Vietnamese, filling the political vacuum. I'll use the term cross-class alliance here because it explicitly describes uniting different classes, and I'll skip over the messy history of leftist jargon and theory on this. Let's pause here and discuss how this relates to today's war. Even MAGA loyalists like Joe Kent, who was Trump's National Counterterrorism Center's director until he resigned in protest of the war, agrees with the following concerns to varying degrees. We'll discuss the contradictions of these MAGA critics in Chapter 3. First, rally around the flag effect. Domestic protests in Iran, note there's a range of motives here that need to be carefully unpacked. These have lost their momentum, as there's now more bargaining power for defense of sovereignty, especially when civilians are bombed by foreign powers. This brings crucial soft power legitimacy to the Iranian state. Kent directly describes this concern. Keep in mind that Kent supports quote-unquote limited strikes, like the Trump regime assassinating General Qasem Soleimani, to pressure Iran to restrain their proxies. And Kent also supports U.S. sanctions on Iran to promote regime change, despite the sanctions' disproportional impact on the most vulnerable. We started by categorizing all of these as hard power, but clearly there are further distinctions to be made. Economic sanctions alone deserves an entire episode. Here's Joe Kent, quote, "Trump slaps maximum pressure sanctions on Iran. That makes the economic life very, very challenging. That results in waves and waves of protests that we were seeing back in January. We saw Iranians out in the streets protesting against the current regime because of the cost of living. Now, the regime knows their own people could overthrow them if they are not happy, especially with just how expensive and challenging it is to live. That organic protest movement was already happening, but it was happening in large part because of the economic pressure that President Trump had put on them. Now, if you want to ruin all that, you go as an outsider with the Israelis and you strike them, because then everyone is going to rally around the flag. That's why we're not seeing any protests. That's why even the Kurds have said, hey, we don't want to be part of any regime change right now. Persians have their pride. I mean, it's not that hard to imagine, to put ourselves in their shoes. We didn't like Joe Biden, but if a foreigner would have attacked America, I'm going to saddle up and I'm going to defend my country. I don't think they are that much different than we are, end quote. We saw in Vietnam's example how war and foreign occupation put further burdens on the peasant base. The Vietnamese ruling class, as colonial collaborators, lost their social legitimacy, with the Vietnamese Communists filling the political vacuum by organizing a rally around the flag against foreign occupation and focusing on the needs of the peasant base. So, we need to repeat the steps of class analysis on the Iranian society to identify the classes, especially the productive base, to analyze the level of organizing, like cross-class alliances, and where the Iranian government's relationships fits into all of this. Second, empower hardliners. Coupled with rally around the flag against foreign occupation is giving more bargaining power for Iranian hardliners who oppose moderates negotiating concessions with the US. Kent directly cites this concern as well. Another point which Kent avoids is how the Trump regime broke prior deals, especially Obama's quote-unquote Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, established in 2015. Third, lose global trust, soft power. Even if Trump avoids escalation and agrees to a peace deal, there's minimal regional and global trust at this point that the US and Israel won't just break the deal in the near future and try another regime change. Kent definitely avoids this one, having supported Trump 1.0, breaking Obama's Iran nuclear deal in 2018 and assassinating General Qasem Soleimani in 2020. Okay, so let's return to the Vietnamese story. Now, the Vietnamese Communists actually became allied with the US as both were fighting Japanese fascism. Japan's World War II defeat led to the Vietnamese Communists under Ho Chi Minh to declare independence as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, DRV, in September 1945. However, Ho's letters to US President Truman for US support of DRV independence were ignored, given the new context of the US anti-communist Cold War. Vietnam was essentially partitioned, with the DRV in the north versus French collaborators in the south. To summarize, colonialism and World War II further burdened Vietnam's base, while eroding status quo soft power, with the Vietnamese Communists being the best organized to fill the political vacuum. The First Indochina War, 1946 to 1954. This war, between the DRV versus the French and their collaborators, foreshadows the Second Indochina War, the so-called Vietnam War, since that's how the US names its wars after other countries. Vietnamese communists pursued protracted war to defeat the French. This meant a long-term, drawn-out, unconventional war. So first, for soft power, this played to the advantages in public morale and support, and the opposition's demoralization. And second, for hard power, despite firepower disadvantages, this did offer time to expand beyond guerrilla tactics to include conventional arms funded by Communist China, following China's 1949 revolution. See Goscha's book, The Road to Dien Bien Phu, A History of the First War for Vietnam. Here we can add another lens, historical materialism. Kalko emphasizes the Vietnamese communist evolution in theory and practice, grounded in a historical materialist approach. In social sciences, this is often associated with Marxism. On a general level, this lens analyzes, first, the society's material conditions. The options for survival in, for example, a rainforest will differ from a desert. Second, under such conditions, how does society produce, distribute, and reproduce its material needs? In Marx's jargon, this is the mode of production. Third, the social relations, especially class, property, and gender, that emerge, the relations of production. Fourth, the ideas that emerge, especially culture, which normalizes the social relations, making them reproducible, thus relatively static. This last layer is more surface level, the superstructure. Now, ideas and material conditions are interacting in a cyclical manner in the systems level as well. The point of this linear list is to understand the function of culture as an adaptation to reproduce society under material constraints. This is the materialist approach. Historical materialism views historical change on the systems level as emerging from the clash between the second step, in particular the dynamism of technology and labor, the forces of production, and the third step, the established, thus relatively static, class, property, and gender roles. The first obvious example is the effects mechanization and automation have on entire professions, drastically altering bargaining power, and the spillover cultural effects. The second important example that deserves wider attention is the effects of wartime restructuring of labor. World War I, and especially World War II, are most striking, given their influence on today's norms, which we take for granted. Working class men were grouped together in the military, increasing their organizing and thus bargaining power. This led to soldiers and veterans bargaining for socialized healthcare and education. The factory jobs they left behind were filled by women, leaving their isolated domestic homes, and minorities, now doing the work they were previously excluded from, and better organized in the workplace. This led to breakthroughs in feminist and civil rights movements, which also bolstered labor union movements. Thus, historical materialism means using a materialist approach to explain historical change. Remember, no lens sees everything in optimal clarity. Each lens starts with certain limiting assumptions in order to view something specific more clearly. The historical materialist lens is specifically useful for unearthing the systems level. Of course, any tool can be used crudely. In the case of materialism, see my review of Jared Diamond's bestseller, Guns, Germs, and Steel: The Fates of Human Societies. We can contrast this four-step materialist approach with the idealist approach, which starts with ideas, often in the abstract, detached from material conditions, basically starting in reverse, and often just getting stuck on the culture step without reattaching to the other steps. We can see in our World War example how structural change was not simply from people's ideas becoming more progressive in the abstract. It took the war's systemic material changes, providing more bargaining power for certain pre-existing ideas of political equality, to win by example. Egalitarian politics, the leveling of class and gender hierarchies. This wasn't invented by the European Enlightenment or the post-war welfare state. This goes way back to hunting-gathering, to the evolution of human nature. What is Politics has the best videos on all of this, featuring materialist anthropology. There are always limited resources in organizing bargaining power for the bottom classes, so it makes sense to prioritize a materialist lens, to think on the systems level, to anticipate opportunities by analyzing leverage points and feedback loops. Okay, that's a general definition. Let's bring it to life and see how the Vietnamese Communists applied historical materialism, according to Coco. First, understanding your own limitations. In this case, the material conditions of being a small, decentralized country, lacking manufacturing technologies and military hard power, targeted by foreign powers for access to China's markets. This understanding led to actions being dictated by critical realism in the form of pragmatic, protracted struggle, relying on soft power. This is a check on hubris, a condition that plagues imperialists. Speaking of imperialist hubris failing in small, decentralized countries, we should immediately think of Afghanistan. Second, understanding your own strengths. In this case, filling in the soft power political vacuum by organizing to build domestic social legitimacy, especially with the mass base of poor and landless peasants. This meant a protracted struggle that went beyond military hard power. We mentioned earlier the contrast in bargaining power between unorganized versus organized. From an anthropology lens, a weakness of rural peasant decentralization is being isolated and lacking communication and knowledge of the outside world, which organizing can help overcome. Kalko writes that, much larger than the Communist Party, mass organizations of Vietnamese peasants, women, students, elderly workers existed since 1930, along with local people's committees. There was a careful balancing act between following grassroots demands versus party leadership. Also, balancing peasant class demands, especially land reform, versus cross-class alliances with patriotic landlords and bourgeoisie. I would add the following framing: an organized, so better integration, relatively egalitarian society, so less hierarchy, a flatter class pyramid. This means more resilience against colonialism's divide and rule playbook. Third, understanding the opposition's strengths and limitations. In this case, understanding how French and anti-communist collaborators, and in the next war the US, all relied on expensive hard power and lacked soft power legitimacy in Vietnam's peasant base, thus building strategies to expose the opposition's contradictions. Protracted war forced mounting costs and dwindling soft power morale. Fourth, international framework. In this case, having a critically pragmatic analysis of the balance of powers, a nuanced understanding of international actors, and how to navigate between them, especially the US, China, and the USSR. This relates to a small country's self-critical realism. Vietnamese communist leaders, like Ho Chi Minh, had early experiences abroad, unlike Stalin and Mao, with not just Western education and experiences, but also experiences in the USSR, China, and Japan. I'll mention transnational class analysis in the resources chapter. Fifth, role of the party. In this case, experience providing continuity for political consciousness between crises, and we've seen there's been many crises. Being self-critical, pluralist, and adaptive to real-world experiences, rather than rigid, grand theory based on abstract ideals. Disciplined cadres who organize peasants on the village level. An emphasis on the critical role of the individual in terms of revolutionary morality and personal responsibility, which Kalko describes as an innovation to Marxism. One cost here was insufficient family life, not to mention the high sacrifices of protracted war. With this list breaking down the Vietnamese Communists' historical materialist approach to theory and practice, I'll leave you to ponder how this compares with the current US opposition in Iran and Israeli opposition in Lebanon. I'll come back to this at the end of the chapter. Second Indochina War, 1955 to 1975. Immediately after resisting French recolonization in the First Indochina War, the DRV plunged into another war with US-backed South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, RVN. This is the US's so-called Vietnam War. We'll see how little US decision-makers learned from France's failures. Remember, the Vietnamese Communists already endured imprisonment by French colonialism, Japanese colonialism's famine during World War II, and 8 years of the First Indochina War with France. By now, the cost of protracted war on the DRV's peasant base meant the DRV had to risk rebalancing away from cross-class alliance to appease the peasantry's demand for land reform, redistributing land from landlords. Subsequent local-led land reforms included excesses against allied landlords, forcing the DRV to intervene again in 1956-57. Kalko also distinguishes between, on the one hand, peasantry's land reform, which was for their own private plots. Remember the peasantry's decentralized isolation. This was still vulnerable to colonial and pre-colonial hierarchies and individualism, such as usury, high-interest loans, and land transfers, eventually reviving inequalities. On the other hand, there's a socialist goal of cooperative agriculture. This was based on solidarity, quote-unquote, rational and predictable agricultural base for national goals of, quote-unquote, modernization and unification. Thus, in 1958, the DRV shifted to the latter cooperative plan, hoping to maintain peasant support by addressing their interest in stability, security, and community integration. Kalko describes the Vietnamese implementation as relatively slow and voluntary, in contrast to Chinese and Soviet collectivization. This involved, first, mutual aid. Land and tools were allowed to remain privately owned, but their use became integrated. Second, reward labor and material contributions while assuring minimum income and shared solutions. Third, control and participation in village level for the poor and middle peasants. Fourth, development successes funded collective welfare, such as public education, healthcare, etc. Meanwhile, communists in South Vietnam formed the National Liberation Front, the NLF, the quote-unquote Viet Cong, to fight an insurgency against the US-backed RVN, with the 1968 Tet Offensive being a turning point in US awareness of their losing position, which I'll detail in the next chapter on the US. Now that we've seen how wars accelerate colonial class conflicts in Vietnam, and how the Vietnamese Communists filled the political vacuum and persevered using historical materialist theory and practice, let's conclude by reviewing a couple of Kalko's outlooks with our ungodly power of hindsight. It's insightful reviewing a scholar's track record. Kalko wrote his book in 1986 and was clearly impressed by the Vietnamese communist-led victories. It's certainly a refreshing contrast to neighboring experiences with post-colonialism, for example, Indonesia and the Philippines. However, we can raise two concerns. First, so-called war communism or siege socialism, leaving social distortions like war hierarchies and war economy. History has proven over and over how capitalist imperialism never allows alternatives to develop freely on their own, and will spend great efforts turning such alternatives into war zones. Vietnamese people are not superhuman. They are just like any other people, struggling with contradictions. The Vietnamese victory stemmed from the chance alignment of material and ideological conditions, creating a political vacuum for dedicated communist organizers to build their bargaining power, as described in this chapter. So it shouldn't be surprising that the end of the war altered such conditions, relaxing communist-led discipline and organizing, and allowing the contradictions of global capitalism, which was not defeated after all, to seep back in. Kalko summarizes this process in a postscript and elaborates further in the 1997 book, Vietnam, Anatomy of a Peace. Second, Kalko praises the DRV's innovative, unconventional warfare as a model for anti-imperialist struggles. This relates to irregular and asymmetrical warfare, adapting to disadvantages in hard power. Quote, "Indeed, just as the United States hoped to develop a limited war capability relevant throughout the globe, the communists articulated political, organizational, and technical responses to American intervention and arms valuable to revolutionary forces everywhere. This fact is likely to compound the difficulties of America's self-appointed counter-revolutionary mission in the Third World for decades to come." End quote. Sadly, US imperialism was already adapting its own form of asymmetrical warfare by funding right-wing insurgencies against post-colonial states. Remember point 4 in our Colonialism's Divide and Rule playbook: bribe right-wing extremists. For example, connecting the influence of US interventions in Indonesia, 1965 to 66, and Guatemala, 1966, see the Jakarta Method, Washington's anti-communist crusade, and the mass murder program that shaped our world. Another example of learning from the Vietnam trap to inflict the Afghan trap on the USSR, see the management of savagery, how America's national security state fueled the rise of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Donald Trump. Asymmetrical warfare is still prominent today. For example, Iran's use of cheap missiles and drones. We'll dive into the US military's costly firepower in the next chapter. Finally, on comparisons with the Iranian clerical regime, I'll just provide some historical context which gets obscured in mainstream media. First, World War II accelerated class conflict globally, not just in Vietnam. For the so-called Middle East, this was highlighted by the overthrow of Western-backed monarchy in Egypt in 1952, led by Nasser. and the rise of the non-aligned movement, meaning not aligned to either side of the bipolar Cold War between the West and the USSR. See the book The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World. Second, Iran's path of decolonization was highlighted by the 1951 nationalization of the British-controlled Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, creating the National Iranian Oil Company. Democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who led this nationalization, was subsequently overthrown by the CIA and MI6 in 1953. The Western-backed monarchy, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, consolidated power. Third, however, patron-client relationships, in this case between the West and the Shah, have an inherent contradiction. The client's desire for more sovereignty against the patron's control. This will be the focus of Chapter 3, Making the Worst Allies. So, the Shah joined the creation of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, in 1960, and nationalized Iranian oil reserves in 1973, straining the Shah's relationship with the West. Fourth, when the Shah appeared vulnerable to domestic protests in 1978, this story gets more contentious. How much did the West support Ruhollah Khomeini's rise to power in the Iranian Revolution? How much did the West underestimate the blowback from the support? How much did the West fear the left opposition in the revolution, shifting Iran to a non-aligned or pro-Soviet position? How likely was this fear of actually occurring? Once again, bribe right-wing extremists. Khomeini took power and crushed the left opposition, which has not recovered since. Speaking of bribing right-wing extremists to crush left alternatives, I'll leave you with these headlines. To summarize Chapter 1, Not Knowing Your Enemy. Our toolbox started with hard power versus soft power, and we added class analysis, colonialism's divide and rule playbook, and historical materialism. We apply these to actually learn about the US's so-called enemy. The Vietnamese Communists used a historical materialist approach in theory and practice. Understanding their own limitations as a small country targeted by giants, they managed to fill the soft power political vacuum left by French colonialism and especially Japanese colonialism, and even managed to set the terms of both the First and Second Indochina wars as protracted wars. This, first, favored their soft power advantage in morale, given they were fighting for survival and had the support of the peasant base and extensive organizing. And second, it lessened their hard power disadvantages by escalating the costs for the opposition, reliant on high-tech hard power. In the next chapter, Breaking Your Alliances, we'll turn our focus to the United States.